Hello, I'm Justin Whitaker. I am the senior correspondent for Buddhist Global based in Hong Kong. Currently in my home in Missoula, Montana. I'm working remotely as so many people are these days, and happy to be joining you. Thank you very much, Venerable Aya Yeshe, for inviting me to be part of this wonderful festival of radical awakening. I had thought about doing a PowerPoint presentation here, but I think the camera won't pick it up very well. It'll be kind of washed out. So I'll see about getting that to you via the website, along with some of the other resources I mentioned in this talk. So my title today is Reimagining a Just Economy. And part of what I'm going to do is simply give you a review of the history of Buddhist economics in the last 50, 60 years, some of the thinkers who have been trying to formulate what a Buddhist economics can look like. And as you'll see, I draw a lot from thinkers in other fields because it's a new and emerging discipline. And as we go along, there's a lot of room for growth and development and borrowing from other more established disciplines out there, such as Buddhist environmentalism. You'll see here Dharma Reign, Dharmagaya, Buddhism and Ecology, three very thick books that have been written over the last 25, 30 years, all trying to gather resources on Buddhism and environmentalism. And I think we're just starting to see some similar efforts such as that coming out in the field of Buddhist economics. But with that as a bit of a preamble, I'll begin, and I look forward to the discussion with you up ahead afterward. So it's a difficult time in Buddhist history or in human history to be optimistic or even realistic about the place we're at now. In the face of so many dire truths in our world today, the easiest stance is surely that of the pessimist. And yet the Buddhist teachings demand some sense of realism, or perhaps even as a balancing force for the overwhelming pessimism of the world, a bit of optimism. The Buddhist message for humanity begins with the noble or ennobling truth of suffering. This human life is marked by the imperfections of our ignorance, our greed, hatred, and the three reinforcing one another in an ongoing cycle of samsara. The second noble truth is the cause of suffering, trishna or tanha, thirsting or craving. And in light of some of the talks that we're going to come up with or have later in this conference, it's important to note that translations can be tricky, especially in Buddhism and in light of modern vocabulary. There's a rich tapestry of terms in Buddhist psychology that is often lost as we translate into English and to a popular audience. So those who have been familiar with Buddhism for 20 years or longer understand this loss and the difficulty of translation. We nonetheless have to choose between often imprecise terms for each occasion. So while a scholar might rightly point out that Buddhism traditionally places greed or desire and anger or hatred into the category of harmful, destructive, or unskillful mental states, many great teachers today are using and can use these terms to refer to positive responses to our current reality. I think we're going to see some of that, especially in terms with dealing with anger. And while so much historical Buddhism sees that as destructive or negative emotion, it can also be turned toward or seen as a wrathful and correct and positive response to harm being done in the world. So similarly with craving, as one abandons self-involved and selfish cravings, one can still cultivate a desire to help others, desire to attain enlightenment or greater spiritual states. So not all desire is bad, not all anger is bad in Buddhism. I think these are kind of the Buddhism 101 teachings will say that Buddhism is meant to overcome all anger, overcome all greed and desire. But it's more complicated as we go along, as we'll see. So again, many of you will know that by heart, but others I've seen stumble across these terms and how they're used in contemporary Buddhism. After all this, the Buddha did teach the third noble truth, the fact that our suffering can be overcome, and of course the fourth noble truth, the path to overcoming suffering. So Buddhism isn't all just the pessimism of the first noble truth, or first and second, but it also offers this kind of realistic image of humanity and this further optimistic vision of our potentials as beings. So definitely not just a purely pessimistic religion. So today, like I said, I'm going to draw together some of the history of Buddhist economics. I'm going to talk specifically about 7 thinkers, and you'll see the first one I go into far more depth than the others. It's just a limitation of time. I'd love to talk more about the others in the Q&A and strongly recommend all of them. The first of these is E.F. Schumacher, well known for writing the book in 1973, Small is Beautiful, a study of economics as if people mattered. He had been sent from England to Burma, ostensibly to help the Burmese modernize their economy. Instead, he wrote a treatise extolling the vision of a Buddhist economy focused on human flourishing and local sufficiency. The book went on to be translated into 27 different languages, and in 1995 was named by the London Times as one of the 100 most influential books written after World War II. After Schumacher, there's not necessarily a pause, but not a great deal of literature being written. We have, and I'll mention briefly, this work by P.A. Payutto, a Thai monk and scholar. But we can kind of jump forward about 25 years to 1997. Before that, I hope that these 6 thinkers all pull together certain ideas that we're going to find commonly in our Buddhist economics, and kind of foundations that we can discuss, and we can discuss how they're applied, or if we have different conceptions or something else we'd like to bring to the table. But these are, first, moral cultivation, a virtue-centered approach for individuals to gradually eliminate our own greed, aversion, and ignorance. So Buddhist economics starts with moral cultivation, something very different from other economic systems. 2, a common thread is generally a move toward simplicity and sustainability, sometimes expressed as minimalism, but also kind of self-sufficiency, going local, trying to minimize one's footprint on the planet as a result of recognizing the kind of hamster wheel of our greed and our consumption. And thirdly, the principle of interconnectedness as a bridge from our individual moral work toward changing the world around us. So Buddhism is sometimes criticized as being overly individualistic, especially caricatures often of Theravada Buddhism as focusing on one's own enlightenment. But Theravada Buddhism, and certainly in Mahayana Buddhism, the virtues cultivated by one are very often outward and relational in nature. So those are the three things I hope to see throughout Buddhist economics, and again, would love to discuss more with you: moral cultivation, simplicity, sustainability, and the principle of interconnectedness as kind of a bridge between self and other. So the first scholar I want to bring up to you is Rita Gross, who many of you will know as perhaps the greatest scholar of Buddhist feminism in the 20th century and into the 21st. She was also very active in the field of Buddhist-Christian dialogue. But for me, one essay she wrote in 1997 on the topic of Buddhist environmentalism is what puts her on my list of thinkers in Buddhist economics. In that essay, Toward a Buddhist Environmental Ethic, Gross begins with the twin problems of consumption and overpopulation. Telling her own life story spent in a rural setting without central heating, indoor plumbing, or processed packaged food, she wrote that despite this, there was no sense of deprivation in the fact that she could, serve as a model, or this kind of life could serve as a model for others serious about developing an environmental ethic. Importantly, she gives guidelines that I think we can borrow from liberally. I'm going to just skip toward my rewriting of those guidelines. She writes, and we're just replacing every time she talks about environmental or ecological with economics here. And so the reason why economic concerns are now so grave is because humans have the technologies to consume and reproduce in ways that, if not moderated, seem almost certain to destroy the ecological or material basis for human life. Therefore, the key question is what values and practices would convince people to consume and produce less or reproduce less when they have the technological ability to consume and reproduce more. The world's religions have not previously faced this situation, which explains why economic ethics have not been in the forefront of the religious thinking in any tradition. What we must do then, as constructive thinkers in our various traditions, is to place the inherited values and insights of our traditions in the light of the current economic crisis and see what resources the tradition affords us and where we need to extrapolate new visions. So again, kind of looking at seeing the economic crisis ahead of us, realizing Buddhism doesn't have a ready answer for this, but that's just because Buddhism historically has never faced anything quite like this, certainly not on the global scale that we see today. In what follows in her essay, she gives a Tibetan Buddhist framework of view, practice, and result, saying that we first reorient people's views away from materialism and consumption, and then for practice, she offers different meditations on breaking down our sense of ego identity. And anybody who's practiced Buddhism knows that this is a ready part of a vipassana practice, or tonglen, taking and giving, any kind of analytic practice where you come to see or analyze the various parts of who or what you are. You could break them down into the 5 skandhas, the 6 elements, into the ebb and flow of sensations, etc. So it's about breaking down our egoic self. When we realize the power of enormous power of interconnectedness, many of us sigh a sense of relief. We're not all alone. Western individualism has a way of separating us, which breeds anxiety as we try to satisfy and protect our individual selves. That me, I, mine, worries and concerns that can dominate our lives. But developing an ever greater sense of community and social responsibility, which flows naturally out of this process, and mutual support brings us ease and even joy. From this realization or change in view, we turn naturally to practices drawn from Buddhism. We can look at the threefold path: ethics, meditation, and wisdom. And though Gross doesn't explicitly mention it, she talks, I think, a lot about the virtue, the Buddhist virtue of renunciation, often spoken of in the terms of becoming a monastic, so a very strong renunciation, but also we can think of the renunciation of our excess consumption, of simply responding, reacting to what we feel are our needs in day-to-day life as lay men and women, householders. She focuses heavily on Trishna, our craving, and just saying how that is a driving force for us in our lives. And capitalism, consumerism has picked up on that and commodified that very drive itself. And when we look at cell phones, I don't have mine handy, but they are dopamine triggers. They kind of tie right into our rewards centers in our brain and kind of train us to respond and react constantly. So if we can learn to recognize that urge, sit with it, let it go, we can become less consumptive and focus more on our community and the world around us. So I'm going to move on a little bit to the next thinker. It's Sulak Sivaraksha. He is a Thai academic, activist, and social critic. He offers similar advice. He's given a talk which I'll offer a link to, called Buddhist Economics in the Age of Globalization. Excuse me. And he, like a lot of Buddhist thinkers, you'll see, goes back to Descartes and Newton and says that their philosophies of individualism and kind of narrow self-interest are a likely starting point for our current economic programs. He says that Buddhist economics means, number one, be aware of greed, hatred, and delusion in yourself. And you cannot do this with a Cartesian approach. Your head alone is not sufficient. You must cultivate your heart. If you studied Western philosophy, Descartes was very much in his head as he created his meditations on first philosophy. Sivaraksha turns then to what he says is the most important thing in our life. That is breathing. And he says relying on good friends. The Buddha was not a god. He was a Kalyanamitta, a good friend. In several questions in the Q&A session with Sivaraksha, that bring up the idea of practicing these principles, he again and again returns to the idea of connecting to one's neighbors. We have walls between ourselves and our neighbors, but we can overcome them. Our barriers are self-created. Our barriers between ourselves and poor and rich are self-created. We can go to those people, we can learn from those people, both the poor and the rich, and see what drives them and what can be done to help them cultivate change. The next two, again, I'm kind of moving quickly through these, are Donald Swearer and Stephanie Kaza. Swearer, who studied extensively in Thailand and has written on many aspects of Buddhism, especially in that area of the world, offered a 2013 lecture titled Buddhist Economics and Oxymoron. In it, he discusses the work of the Thai scholar monk P.I. Payutto, who wrote Buddhist Economics. I'm not sure the date on this exactly. 1994. And he also talks about some case studies in Thailand, a traditionally Buddhist country, individual monastics trying to put Buddhist economics into action. One is Wat Dhammakaya and the other is Santi Asok. I'll kind of skip over the details of those, but other Buddhist economists have talked about other groups such as the Western Buddhist Order, now Triratna, and some of their attempts at building right livelihood businesses. So there are cases of Buddhists in the contemporary world trying to build economic systems that work. And I think this is one of the questions I would ask of you, especially if you're drawn to kind of the radical side of radical awakening in the contemporary world. Kind of what does Buddhist economics look like to you, and how do we get from here in this very Western-dominated consumption ethos to there? And that's kind of the difficulty I see. Is like the steps, or do we leap toward your particular version of utopianism, whatever that may be. Stephanie Kaza, whose book I have here, she's worked primarily in environmental thought. She's a practicing Soto Zen Buddhist and has worked in interreligious dialogue as well. This work draws strongly from her environmentalism background, but also on Buddhism, and she's the editor. There are many great contributions here. As she writes in the introduction here, her own concern is that consumer identity is crowding out or displacing an ecological identity. Our sense of place, ecological concerns, and environmental values such as respect and compassion and reverence for life make up that ecological identity. How much are we connected to the trees around us, the rivers, the mountains, the air, the water supplies, and how much are we instead connected to brands, the bottled water we drink, and our cell phones, and the type of computer we have, and even the books we have behind us. We have to realize that the more we are connected to material consumer items, the less we have of our own time and energy to devote to a sense of place and a sense of ecological connectedness. She says, noting David Loy, who writes in the book and is a well-known Buddhist thinker on economics, environmental thought, and more, that the drive to consume has displaced the psychic space once filled by religion, family, and community. And I would urge you to contemplate how much that is the case in your own life. I recognized in reading this and thinking about it that, yes, a lot of my own thought in recent months, weeks, years has been about, what do I need in terms of items and just stuff to make myself feel comfortable, rather than, what kind of activities can I have amongst community, friends, family, etc., in nature that will, in a different way, much deeper, more lasting, and sustainable way, make me feel comfortable. So the last two thinkers I want to call your attention to are Claire Brown, who's written this more recent book on Buddhist economics, as well as Ernest C.H. Ng. He has written a book that is just out in 2020. I don't know the full title offhand. I'll make sure it's available to you. But it's also on Buddhist economics and a real tour de force of the history of Western economics and how Buddhism can respond, and as is Claire's wonderful book as well. But both of them are working today to really establish this field of Buddhist economics. Brown, a professor of economics herself at UC Berkeley, and Ng is an assistant professor at the Center for Buddhist Studies at the University of Hong Kong. He's also the CEO of a Buddhist NGO in Hong Kong. Both have been active in the European Spirituality in Economics and Society Institute, and they were major speakers at a conference at the University of Hong Kong in 2019, where I met both of them. Again, I have to skim over or almost kind of forego talking about the particulars of their work, only to say they cover a lot of the similar ground in looking at mindsets, looking at Buddhist practices that can turn us away from consumption and greed particularly, and also tying in aspects of environmental ethics and a sense of stewardship and connection with nature as a replacement for our connection with consumer goods, which is really the dominant paradigm of our world today. So in terms of conclusion, and hopefully moving on to open up the discussion with you, at the outset I said I hope some key themes would have emerged. The work being done in the field so far is very diverse and formative, and the path is by no means clear. I feel like we're at a place of crisis in many ways in human history, and do we rush forth as Buddhist thinkers and really get out there, or is there a time for kind of slow and steady development? Do we need big, quick, strong, radical change, or do we need very small, pointed alterations, small changes that over time will give great results? What has been clear since the 1960s and 1970s is that the dominant Western paradigm of growth and consumption cannot be sustained. Many Buddhists and scholars saw this and turned toward rethinking the ways that we connect to the environment, and thus environmental philosophy and green Buddhism began to flourish. Again, some of these great books. And at the same time, these movements had and continue to have economic impacts in their practice and in their ways of thinking, which is again why I think we can draw from Buddhist environmental thought, Buddhist ethics thought, as we think about Buddhist economics. I think the language, the problems translate into one another very well. E.F. Schumacher saw this with an uncanny clarity. But it has taken more time for this emerging world of Buddhist economics to be realized. Today, the unifying message of Buddhist economics is that we must first address our own mental defilements. As long as we are stuck on the hamster wheel of desire, consume, and so on, we cannot meaningfully contribute to a broader societal good. As we do this, our generosity can act as both a tool for growth, giving as a way to connect with those in need, and as a result of that growth, having seen our interconnectedness, it only makes sense to reach out and help where and when we see suffering. The challenge to a Buddhist economics, or the challenges to a Buddhist economics, are many. Chief among them is simply the momentum of the contemporary paradigm and its amazing ability to co-opt anything that works against it. I often think of the Che Guevara t-shirt being sold at Walmart, all of the commodification of Buddhism, and wonder how can Buddhism flourish as a meaningful counter, perhaps even as a threat to the contemporary paradigm. And maybe it's very important for the development of Buddhist economics not to be seen as a threat, but as something helping, as part of the slow changing of humanity. On the other hand, maybe we don't have time for a slow changing of humanity. Human desires and ignorance, let alone hatred, are enormous. And as I said at the outset, it's easy to be pessimistic as one surveys humanity today. So I want to thank you for taking the time to watch this, and I very much look forward to having this discussion with you about these points and seeing what ideas come about.